Hello, party people, and welcome to office hours at Vestrahorn in the south of Iceland. It's a little oceanfront mountain here where there's a tide, there's a bay behind me that's going to fill up as we get closer to high tide. I don't know that I'm going to go that long. I'll probably only go 20-30 minutes here, but it has just a really nice reflective effect too in the sand. Really pretty. There's also an old NATO radar station out here as well, down that used to warn the Americans about the incoming Ruskies, I suppose. So let's go take a look at your questions. So the number one top upvoted question was from Scott M. He says, "Hi Brent, SP Blitz Who and SP Who is Active are great troubleshooting tools for SQL Server. When do you recommend using one over the other?" Oh, so this is interesting, and giving you an answer on this requires giving you a little bit of backstory around both tools. SP Who is Active was originally written by Adam Mechanic, a brilliant SQL Server person out of the Boston, Massachusetts area. And when Adam first wrote it, it was almost like back during the shareware days of SQL, or back during the shareware days period, where there wasn't really an established path to making money with scripts. And so Adam had the script copyrighted and he experimented with making it for pay for businesses. Well, as we were doing consulting, we needed a tool that we could use out freely with folks and that we could put under licenses like the GPL or MIT license, where we could freely install it on client servers without having to deal with any gotchas. So we wrote SP Blitz Who, not because there was something broken with SP Who is Active, but just because we needed something purely open source that we could use to make money with our careers. Shortly thereafter, Adam Mechanic ended up open sourcing SP Who is Active. He stopped doing so much work with the SQL Server product, started going off to other big data type things in cloud. So he open sourced it. If I remember right, it's the MIT license. I can never remember if it's MIT or GPL. So we never really needed to do SP Blitz Who at this point, but it's already out there. So there are some things that SP Blitz Who does better. There are some things that SP Who is Active does better. But at this point, the licensing is effectively free for both tools, so that the licensing is less of a concern. I tend to use SP Who is Active when the server's on fire and I need a response immediately just to know if the server's okay. But if I'm doing more fine-grained troubleshooting, if I'm looking at memory grants and queries, for example, I tend to use SP Blitz Who because it gives more information by default. Of course, the fact that it gives more information by default is why it takes longer to run. So if every millisecond counts, you use SP Who is Active. If you need to do more in-depth troubleshooting and you don't mind waiting a second or two longer for answers, then SP Blitz Who gives you that detail. Next up, let's see here. We have Brandon. Brandon says, "I'm filtering on price and start date. Regardless of parameter values, Clippy always suggests indexing price, then start date, and never vice versa. Can I conclude that Clippy doesn't consider selectivity?" Yes. If you search for Brent Ozar, how does SQL Server build missing index requests? I've got an answer out on Stack Exchange where, thanks to one of my training class attendees, we figured it out, that what SQL Server is doing is it's recommending the list of columns in order that they are in the table. It has nothing to do with your parameter selectivity. It has everything to do with just the order of columns that they are in the table. You can prove that by running experiments, and if you look for my answer over on Stack Exchange, I give you experiments to show how to prove it. But another way that you can prove it is to look at the execution plan's XML. When you're looking at an execution plan that includes a missing index recommendation, right-click on the execution plan and click Show the XML, and then look at the individual XML, and you'll see under the missing index request group, column number 1, column number 2, column number 3, they're ordered in the exact order that they are in the table. Has nothing to do with selectivity. There is one additional gotcha, but rather than going into that with inside a video where I don't have demo scripts, I'll just refer you over to that Stack Exchange answer where I show you all the details on how Clippy generates that. It's so terrible. Once you know that, then it really influences how you interpret Clippy's results, because you probably know what's selective about the table, whereas Clippy does not even bother looking at that kind of thing. Next up, we have Hugo. Hugo says, I've got a table that's used as a temporary placeholder, and data is inserted and deleted constantly. Under high concurrence scenarios, a query that uses this table has a bad execution plan. The table is constantly having update statistics. Have you ever had scenarios? Good God, it's like, a train leaves Philadelphia at 4 p.m. The conductor enjoys grilled cheese and nachos. He has a pet named Buffy, who's a goldfish that always likes to use her left fin. For the love of God, will you just get to the point? I try to exclude, make the question box as small as possible on PolGab so that y'all can't ask questions like this. It's like a Stephen King novel. The last sentence says, have you had scenarios where disabling auto update statistics is a good fit? Hugo, just for future reference, ask the question. You don't need to tell your life story. So have I had situations where disabling statistics was a good fit? Yes. So a classic example is a table that has all kinds of churn, like what you're describing. Another example is a very large table where every now and then we take the effort to do an updating of statistics with full scan. But if we happen to hit the auto update stats threshold, I don't want to get brand new stats just done with a small amount of sampling, and I don't want to take the time that it would take to do a full scan update of the statistics in the middle of the business day while people are running queries, especially if the statistics just don't influence execution plans all that much on that particular query. What about my goldfish? Next up, Kavia MP says, hi Brent, I recently joined a company as a SQL developer. I see lots of NOLOCK query hints all over the place. I'm going to scroll down a little here. My friend suggested RCSI as an alternative for that. Is my friend correct? Yes. Next up, let's see here. Come on over here and move this over a little so I can move these questions around. Next up we have, move these around, Glev. Glev says, hello, do you use Postgres as a developer in products that you build, or do you offer help with troubleshooting Postgres problems as well? I use Postgres as a consumer, but not as a teacher. I don't want to offer training classes on something until I can explain how its query optimizer works. And I haven't put in any time into Postgres to try to figure out how its query optimizer works. I am what they call in the business old. I am in my 40s now, in my late 40s. And I kind of bet the farm on SQL Server. If there was going to be something that I would learn in more depth, in order to teach y'all, it would likely be Azure SQLDB, not Postgres. It's not that I don't love Postgres, I do, but I'll tell you what, if you want to make a lot of money, work on something that's expensive. If you don't want to make a lot of money, work on something that's free. The training class budgets for people who work with MySQL and Postgres are naturally lower than companies who spend $7,000 a CPU core to license their SQL servers. So do I like Postgres as a consumer? Sure, but am I going to make any money on teaching Postgres training classes? Not compared to what you make doing SQL Server training classes, because the product is so much more expensive. All right, next up we have Fundamentals of MS Docs asks, I'm asking this because I don't trust myself to interpret Microsoft Docs correctly. If you have the highest compatibility level and query optimizer fixes is set to on, how does this differ from being the highest compat level and having this set to off? Do you get updates beyond RTM? Yes. Microsoft ships changes to behavior after release to manufacturing. So like SQL Server 2019 has fixes that have changed since SQL Server 2019 shipped. The catch is you have to know what those fixes are. And I hate the term fixes because it just means, what it really means, what it's supposed to mean, is it's supposed to mean different behavior. You hear query optimizer fixes and you think, oh, something is broken, it needs to be fixed. When in reality, what it's much more about is Microsoft has decided to change query optimizer behavior. If you're the kind of person who's able to test all of your queries to make sure that they don't get worse execution plans, then sure, by all means, start playing around with random switches. But otherwise, don't use switches like that unless you're instructed to by either Microsoft or by someone who looks at multiple execution plans, compares them side by side, shows you the differences, and shows you why that switch is better. Otherwise, they are not fixes, they are just changes in behavior. Next up, PPI asks, can log shipping be an option for migration between SQL Server 2012 and 2016 in a production environment? Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of this. What I like to do is I like to set up log shipping between the old server and the new server. Set it up so that it's working. Now, you won't be able to read the production server until you go live, but once you go live, then all of a sudden you'll be able to restore the databases very quickly with a minimum amount of outage. The way that I use log shipping is that I'll set up that log shipping ahead of time, have the data flowing through from one to the other, and then break it. Turn off replication between the two by not taking the last tail of the log back up in production, but just simply assuming that the new production server has gone live just for testing purposes. Run restore with recovery, and then that way people will be able to access the new production server. But this is for test purposes only, so that they can test that their applications work, that there's no behavior changes in performance, that my maintenance plans are set up correctly, things like that. So then that way, after they all sign off that things are working well, I'll tear down that and set up the log shipping again, reinitialize the log shipping, so that way I know it's going to work well when we go to failover. But log shipping, database mirroring, always on availability groups, I kind of think of migrations in that order. Log shipping is my very favorite. Database mirroring would be my second favorite because it doesn't require Windows clustering. Always on availability groups would be my last favorite for migrations, just because it makes migrations so complex, as opposed to log shipping is relatively simple. Next up, Andrew asks, when a participant in your training classes isn't able to follow your instructions and your attention on them is taking the class down, what internal metrics do you use to know when to cut them off? Oh, so this is interesting. So you kind of think of my training classes as like, the beginning is the free stuff like how to think like the engine, and I rarely do those interactively. If someone can't follow how to think like the engine, often they just self-opt out at that point. They're like, this training class doesn't work for me, it's not my style, and they go find something else. The next level in is my fundamentals classes that are only 1 day long. Those fundamentals classes that are only 1 day long tend to be 45 minutes of lecture and then a 30-minute lab. And during that 30-minute lab, they go on and do their work to prove what they just learned. As they're passing in their answers to me, I'll often say things like, whoop, timeout, you didn't finish how to think like the engine, or you didn't finish one of the other prerequisites. Before you go further in this class, you need to stop and go back and do the prerequisite material. Setting that tone early on in the fundamentals classes that are only 1 day old helps people understand that they can't skate by in my classes. If you're not keeping up, I'll say, here's the prerequisite material that you missed. I need you to stop here and go back and hit that prerequisites. I have no mercy at all on that in the fundamentals classes. By setting that tone, I don't have the problem in the mastering classes. The only time I have that problem in the mastering classes is when someone tries to skip fundamentals altogether. And I'll just say, hey, look, I'll cut right to the chase. Because of the nature of your question, I can tell that you didn't do the fundamentals class here, or it's been a really long time since you did it. I need you to go ahead and watch that fundamentals class and come back to the recordings of this class when you're ready, but you're not ready right now. Next up, Rojo asks, we're considering multiple satellites in the cloud, that phone home data to our in-house mothership, one source of the truth. What is the best way to forward data back and make sure that we're talking to the mother without real loss? Real time not required, but daily updates. Okay, so there are a couple things that set off red flags inside here. When you say that the mothership is one source of the truth, but the satellites have the data and they're sending it back to the mothership, I don't think that means what one source of truth means. If you could put a bullet in any one of the satellites, erase it and walk away and not be concerned, then yes, the mothership is the one source of the truth, and that's a correct read on that situation. I'll give you an example. One of the clients that I work with does have a central mothership that's like supposedly the single source of the truth. Then SQL servers in, I'm going to call them factories. That's not what it is, but I'm obfuscating what the client really does. They have SQL servers all over the world in factories, and those SQL servers collect real-time operational metrics, and once an hour, they send those metrics back up to the mothership. We can lose any factory SQL server at any time, and we don't give a rip, because the data that's in them is just helping them monitor the factory machines to make sure that they're still healthy. But there's no customer order data in there, for example. In a situation like that, if we assume that that's really what it is, that the mothership is a single source of the truth and the satellites are disposable, they can be just erased at any given time, then at that point, I'm a huge fan of having like a C# app or a Java app that pulls down all of the applications from each satellite and then dumps them in a flat file closer to the mothership. I don't want to use anything related to SQL Server. I don't want to use replication. I don't want to use log shipping. I don't want to use link servers, because I want something that can continue to work regardless of what happens with Active Directory, what happens with authentication, what happens with firewalls. I want the most bulletproof way of moving data around. But as soon as you try to have two SQL servers talk to each other, you're in for a world of hurt. Other ways to think about this are like how data warehouse people do it, that they'll do extract, transform, and load. They will extract from one server, do some transformations, and then load it into the mothership for a different source of the truth. If, on the other hand, you mean that those satellites, the data really can't be lost, that's another question altogether. And in that case, that's way beyond what you would want to rely on a quick back and forth via office hours on. That's really, if you want to coordinate data across multiple servers, the problem that you're going to run into is conflict resolution, where what happens when the data in between those two servers doesn't agree? How do you resolve conflicts? And that's much harder. Next up, Daniel says, hey Brent, what do you suggest for a DBA managing memory optimized tables with 200 million rows with VARCHAR max in terms of memory estimation and maintenance? I would recommend a new job. Memory optimized tables with 200 million rows using VARCHAR max. Everything about this screams bad idea genes, like that I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. In memory optimized is not for stuff like VARCHAR max and 200 million rows. And when you start talking about memory, I wouldn't do that. I don't want to say under any circumstances, but I've never seen a scenario where I would want to do that. Now, I'm going to tweak your question. What if you said it was just 200 million rows with integers, just a handful of integers and nothing else? How do you do memory estimation? Well, it's easy. You build a 200 million row table, and you run things like an update that affects all 200 million rows and go see how much memory that uses up. And it's going to be large, but that helps you understand how much memory you're going to need in order to accomplish operations. Because after all, you can't prohibit someone from doing big, ugly operations like updating entire tables. When you start doing that on VARCHAR max, there's no limit on, no practical limit on how much people can stuff in a whole bunch of VARCHAR max columns. That's a recipe for disaster in terms of memory management. Next up, Simon says, how can I predict if my SQL server has enough resource capacity to handle a 50% increase in workload? Oh, it's a great question. So the challenge with that is, I'm going to give a couple of crazy examples. What if your 50% increase in upload means accepting 50% more rows? Like right now you're adding 1,000 rows a day. Pretty soon you're going to be adding 1,500 rows a day. The things that I might worry about there are blocking, like lock contention as people are doing these inserts, and disk space, transaction log space. What if your 50% activity meant 50% more users that were updating one row? Which sounds crazy, but think about a shopping scenario where I'm worried about tracking the number of available products that are, or number of available items of a product that are available at any one time. I'm there exclusively worried about locking. I'm worried about a lot more people hitting exactly the same tables. What if it's 50% more selects? What if it's a data warehouse where we're looking at adding 50% more staff and I'm trying to figure out whether we'll be able to do 50% more reports? In that case, I'm worried about things like memory grants or CPU overhead, depending on what their queries look like. So it's really all about knowing what's the bottleneck that you're facing today in your workload. And then if you had 50% more users doing the same thing, how would that affect your bottleneck? And of course, the answer is going to change so much depending on whether your workload is inserts, updates, selects, and of course it's a mix, but what is that mix? And it would be very hard to get someone to know that answer if you're just asking some stranger wearing an Icelandic sweater, standing on a beach in Iceland, thousands of miles away from your workload, who's never heard of you before. That's not a plug for consulting either. Like if you asked me to fix that via consulting, that would be extremely expensive. That's pretty ugly. Yeah, but that's why there's not a Google answer out there. It's hard work. Matt says, bored out of its gourd is something that you say often about servers. Is there a situation where the DBA deserves credit for that? No, because it means you're over-provisioned. It means you provisioned way too much horsepower for your workloads. If you have an 80 CPU core server and it's sitting around not doing anything, that's not to the DBA's credit, it's to the DBA's detriment that they over-provisioned so much and that they're making their company spend so much on licensing. So that's why I don't clap DBAs on the back for that. Next up we have Severio asks, Severio says, in a database in full recovery model, when I create a clustered index on a large and busy transactional heap, what should I expect about my transaction log growth, both using online on equals off? I can't find comprehensive details in docs online about that. Yeah, so when you ask, what's going to happen when I do A, and you're looking for a manual to tell you that, I wonder why you don't just go do the thing. Just go do it. Just go do it. You'll find out. Not in production. Do it in development. That's what you have a development server for. I feel like I'm Seinfeld. What's wrong with you people? Go do it. It's creating an index online and off. It's like 30 characters. Go do it. Go measure. And don't have log backups on while you do it. And you can go see how big the log backup becomes. Do you see baby food here? Why are you thinking that I'm going to feed you baby food? Go do it. It's easy. Come on, for the love of God. Next up, good transition. The Terrible DBA asks, my friend is a production DBA, but he wants to move to database development or database architect role in that same company. Who should he approach and how? And what skills should he focus on? Okay, so because I of course made that same transition, I'm going to tell you what worked for me. It's not for everybody, but what worked for me is identify who the customers are that you want to serve. For example, if you want to become a database development or development DBA, your customers would be the developers and the stakeholders in the application who want that app to go faster. So you would go approach those people and say, hey, what are your big performance concerns today? What things can I help you with? and you start building a track record amongst that of the people in your organization, that the developers look to you as the resource that they can go to in order to make their application go faster. And then they will effectively, you said that in your notes in there that your manager was a systems administrator, or your friend's manager is a systems administrator manager. What you're looking for is you want the head of development to go fight for you. You want the head of development to go, I need this person. They're really important to my team and my team's success in terms of performance. I want that person to report to me. Now you see the work that you would have to do is you have to make them a happy customer of yours. Architect is so much harder because you probably are in competition with people in the development team who already want to become architects, and they're on that team. So that's a much tougher road to hoe. If you're trying to pull it off in other companies, you need a history of architecting things, and that's much easier for a developer to accomplish than it is for a production DBA. So I'd focus on the development DBA and focus on who your customers are. Next up, Mark says, I'm making an ODS, backup and restore via SSIS. I have questions. Backup and restore via SSIS from production onto a different server, and then run scripts to create tables. Okay, nope. So I'm not a big fan of what you're doing here. So I am not a big fan of having SSIS take backups of production, restore it somewhere else, and then go start making changes of tables. This design pattern that you're talking about here is called Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day is where you wake up, it's a movie by Bill Murray, where every day he wakes up and he lives the same day over and over again until he figures out how to break through past that. That's what you're really asking a data warehouse to do is, all right, every day, let's wake up, get a fresh cup of coffee, and rebuild this data warehouse from scratch. You know, of course, performance is going to be terrible. It's not going to be really good. I get that it's easy. I get that it's really easy to write. Every day, we're going to start over from scratch. Create table. Hey, let's load it. It's going to take forever. Whereas if you start working on incremental changes, just only loading the changes that need to be applied, you're going to get down to dramatically faster load times, and you won't have this every day rewrite the entire database from scratch type approach. So that's what I would recommend is don't do the rebuild from scratch every day. Then we'll take one more question. The last question we'll take, let's see, JJ. JJ says, hi, I've been a developer for a while now, and I've always played with MySQL and Microsoft SQL Server. I have a broad understanding of stuff. I like how he says that. My question is, as a developer, where do I start learning more about the database side? I'm talking about indexes, tuning, and fault fixing. Okay, so of course, I didn't mean for that to be a last question, and that's going to sound like a plug for my training classes. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, I happen to sell training classes on it for that exact purpose. If you go to BrentOzar.com and click training on the top, now, of course, that costs money. So what you can also do is go to my YouTube channel. If you go to Brent Ozar and look at my past videos, I have tutorials on all kinds of things for free. The other thing that we're really lucky for in the SQL Server industry is that the user community gives back so much that if you look at the conferences that are out there, Group By, Data Weekender, I mean, they're just a huge number of online SQL Server conferences that are all totally free, and they put a lot of their material up on YouTube. You can use those to then help grow your knowledge of the performance tuning side. The drawback of all those free resources, and I think you should use them, the drawback of all those free resources is they're in 30 to 90 minute chunks, and there's no clear table of contents to help you go from zero to hero. I guess it should have gone zero to hero. There's no clear table of contents to get you from A to Z, and that's where things like training classes come in. But if you have no budget, what you can do is just start going through those YouTube videos for all these free SQL Server conferences out there, build your own training plan and your own table of contents, and then pick the things that you want to learn and become an expert on from there. when you do have a budget, that's where you'd go tackle training classes instead, and they give you the here's what you do in order to become an expert on that topic. All right, well, we got a little bit of sun here in Vestrahorn, so we're going to be heading out now, driving down the south coast of Iceland, going down to Vik, and then where are we going to? Oh, the plane, the abandoned plane. So there was a Justin Bieber video that featured this abandoned military plane crashed on the coast. Really pretty scenic sight. We saw it during the winter, but now a friend of mine, Peter Moorfield, is in town, in country. We're taking him around to a few of our favorite sites. So now we're going to go drive out there and go see it. None of us are that big of fans of, we're not beliebers, as they say, although the fact that I know that the term belieber exists is probably a bad sign. None of us are that big of fans of beliebers by any means, but it's a glorious place to see. And here, just to turn this thing around and give you a little bit different of a view for a minute. So there's the ocean out there. We got the ocean. The tide is slowly coming in here. There is an old military radar installation over there as well. Let's see if I can move this a little bit more and maybe even get you a view of that as well. So with that, I will leave y'all, and I will see y'all at the next office hours. Adios.